Hey, I'm Mike. I built this bar about 6 years ago. I used a slab of red walnut with a live edge on the front and a metal base. Now I'm going to rebuild the base out of wood with shelves in the back and lights. I'm going to use hard maple for the base and birdseye maple for the shelves. And I'm going to use strips of dark Wenge wood as inlay features on all the different edges in the front and sides and back. Well, I laid out all the boards and marked up where we're going to make all the cuts for all the different panels. So now I'm going to cut them roughly to size, run them through the joiner and planer, and glue them up into panels. The first piece of inlay work on this project is for the back edges of the two side pieces. What I want to happen is I want to have 3/8 inch edges showing on the sides, but from the backs it will be the full width of the board, which is 3/4 of an inch. So to achieve that, I'm going to cut 27-degree edges on the side pieces and on the Wenge strips and glue them into place. When I work with oily woods, I like to use some denatured alcohol to strip off the oil before I glue it up. Next, I want to run the edges of the shelves through the router with a V-groove bit so that I can glue up corresponding shaped pieces of Wenge into the back edges. I have the router set up in my router table with a couple of feather boards to keep the piece tight against the fence, and a V-groove bit, and some dust collection. My friend Kyle's going to help me run the shelf edges through the router because they're pretty awkwardly large pieces and I really want to run them through without any wobble. We're going to do it in a sequence of passes, starting with the bit partially raised, then we'll run them through, turn them around, run them the other direction, and then we'll raise the bit the rest of the way and repeat. The reason for turning them around like that is because it's difficult to get the bit perfectly centered on the board, so turning them around guarantees that they're centered. You can see this piece of Wenge that I need to rip down a 45-degree rip cut for this edge and then another 90-degree get the other edge. This is a pretty narrow piece, and when I put the track in place, the clamp is going to clamp onto this back piece where I'm going to clamp that onto the workbench. And so to make that work, since this is just loose, I'm going to hot glue this piece of Wenge onto this piece of board, and then that'll just be a temporary glue that'll hold it in place while I'm doing the cuts, and then I can remove the glue. Now I'm going to glue the Wenge strips up into those V-grooves. Before I do, I just want to point out, I think it's really cool how different this wood looks from the grain from the different sides. That cut versus that cut versus that cut. I'm going to use miter joints to attach the front and side pieces, and I'll later route out square channels into the front of those joints into which I'll inlay the Wenge strips. Doing it that way avoids having extra lines show, as would happen if I were to join the front and side pieces up at 90 degrees. I'm also going to route channels into the sides for the shelves to go into, and then I'm going to add 3 dominoes into the back of the front piece to give some additional support to hold all the weight of the bottles. I did a try run dry fitting the front and sides, and it took 25 minutes to get it done, which is too long. That Type Bond 2 only has 10 to 15 minutes setup time. So Kyle's going to help me assemble it. Now I'll cut the shelves down to size to fit in the cabinet. I want to do this as precisely as I can to avoid any gaps between the Wenge strips on the backs of the shelves and the cabinet. I'll use an X-Acto knife to mark where I need to cut it off side to side, and I'll use a feeler gauge to mark how much I need to cut off from the back to make it fit flush down into the cabinet. These are the electrical components I need for powering the lights, the transformer and the controller that lets me dim the lights and also have a remote control. So I'm going to build a junction box out of some offcuts of maple I have laying around, and I'm going to use 3/8 inch thick boards to try to minimize the footprint inside the cabinet. I have a bunch of pieces of 6/4 and 5/4 boards laying around, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to resaw on the bandsaw to cut these down into half and then plane them. And to do that safely, what I'll end up doing is hot gluing the pieces onto another board, because you can't plane below a certain thickness. In case you're wondering why I always wear a full face mask instead of safety glasses and a dust mask, it's because the safety glasses always get fogged up with the dust mask, and that doesn't happen with the full face mask. Also, this full face mask has better particulate filter. This is a P100, whereas the dust mask is only an N95. To form the raceways, I'm going to rip these 2 boards down to 1 inch by 1 inch, and then I'm going to use the data blade to cut 5/16 inch deep channels in them. Now I'm going to glue in the top shelf. As the first step, I'll mix up a fillet of fine sawdust and wood glue, and I'll apply the fillet in the voids that were left from routing up the grooves for the shelves. Now I'll cut 3/8 inch square channels in the front edges of the piece and 3/8 inch square pieces of Wenge to go in those channels. Well, as you can see, I'm getting some tear out here. So I'm going to clamp on a sacrificial board, and I still got quite a ways left to plunge down, so I should get past that tear out and hopefully get a real good clean cut for the rest of it. So that worked pretty well. No more tear out over here where it used to be. There's a little spot over here where the piece was just a little bit thicker on one side than the other, just from imperfections in the glue up. And that's easy enough to clean up with a chisel. Well, as you can see, there's a little gap in here between the two board faces that were glued up in this miter joint. So I'm going to use this glue syringe to inject a little bit more glue down in this edge. Before I attach the slab top to the cabinet, I'm going to sand the cabinet down to 150 grit because it's easier to do that now before the top blocks access to the shelf areas. Once the entire thing's assembled, I'll do finish sanding down to 220 grit. Well, I'm going to need to do some work on this slab to get it to work with that cabinet. I previously had built a walnut track to have it set down inside that metal base, so I'm going to need to cut that off. I had also built up this area here to flatten out the surface because it was concave from the way it was cut at the sawmill before, and I'm going to need to extend that so I have a bigger flat area because the wood cabinet is wider. I'm not going to try to plane the underside of the slab completely flat because I want to retain its thickness. Instead, there's some high spots I need to plane down, and then there's one low spot left from how it was cut at the sawmill that I need to build up. The way I'll do that is I'll route out a little channel, and I'll cut a piece of wood to fit in the channel and glue it up. I'm going to apply several finishes for this project. I'm going to use a natural color stain because I'm not looking to darken the wood, I just want the stain to make the grain pop. I'm going to use this product called Mohawk Rock Hard Tabletop Urethane Varnish because it's much more resilient than polyurethane is to problems like people leaving wet glasses on the bar or overenthusiastically slamming a glass down on the bar top. I don't want to use it everywhere because it's quite a tricky finish to apply, especially on vertical surfaces. So instead, I'm going to use this on the bar top and the two shelves, and then I'm going to use polyurethane everywhere else. And I'm going to use 3 coats of each of those finishes. Now the first step is I need to remove the existing polyurethane coat on the bar top from when I first built the bar. I don't want to use citrus strip for that because I don't want to get that product down inside the live edges. Instead, I'm going to use my polisher with a 220 grit sanding disc and sand the bar top all the way back to the raw wood and then just leave the live edges alone. I'm going to install the electrical junction box and tracks in the piece before I apply the polyurethane finish because I cut the tracks to quite a tight fit between the shelves, and if I put the polyurethane in first it would be difficult to get the tracks in. Now I'll do the electrical installation so I have lights on the shelves when I apply the urethane varnish. Now I'm ready to apply the urethane varnish. This is a tricky finish to apply. It really easily forms bubbles. The key is to minimize how much you disturb it. So pour it and stir it gently, and then don't overbrush. Just a quick stroke forward and backward and move on. If everything goes well, any bubbles that form will pop on their own when the finish is allowed to dry slowly. And to that end, what I do is I thin it a little bit extra with some mineral spirits, and then I close up the whole shop, turn off any vents, etc. Wear a good VOC mask and just try to get the finish on and get out of there quickly to let it cure and let the bubbles pop. Well, after applying 3 coats of the urethane varnish, I ended up with some small bubbles on both ends of the slab top. So I'm going to use this scratch remover product that's actually made for cars with my polisher and a 1000 grit polishing disc to get rid of those. After I finish buffing out those bubbles, I'm going to go over the whole piece with some of this deluxing compound, which is a combination of buffing compounds and waxes, and that'll just give it a nice smooth feel and a nice shiny look. I'm going to cut out a piece of self-adhesive felt that I can affix to the bottom of the piece so that it's easy to slide the piece around without damaging our wood floors. Well, I finished building the bar. Turn on the lights. this has been a really fun project. There was a lot of interesting woodworking techniques to do, and I really like using Wenge for those inlay pieces. Thanks for watching.